They planned and prepared the bomb. They came to Omagh and they declared war on a non-suspecting civilian population.
Innocent souls murdered brutally in this town. I can't understand it. You wouldn't do that to an animal.
We had experienced this brief period of peace and then it was completely shattered by something so horrendous.
The immediate aftermath of a car bomb explosion in Omagh, County Tyrone. The £500 blast left dozens of people dead or injured in the street. 49-year-old Anne McComb had been working in a clothing store. Her husband Stanley is still haunted by the horror of how she met her death.
The way they left Anne is unspeakable, and it's, you know, I mean, I saw Anne in the morgue, and nobody, there's no husband or father or son or anything should see their mother or their wife or their sister or whatever in a state like that. Unbelievable.
Tell us about Anne.
Anne was just one in a million. She was fantastic. Fantastic mother to my two sons. Great wife, and thought of everybody else. I don't think she had an enemy in the world.
29 people were killed. One victim was 7 months pregnant with twins. Her 18-month-old daughter and her mother also died. 3 generations of one family. 16 of the dead were under the age of 25. 21-year-old Aidan Gallagher had gone into town with a friend to buy new jeans.
I'll never forget, as he walked down the hall, he turned and looked back and he says, "I won't be long," and that was the last time we seen Aidan. I went back to the garage, and about an hour after it back I could hear a loud explosion. I got up from underneath the car, I drove home, and then it was, you know, where's Aidan? And we couldn't understand why he hadn't contacted us. I had to drive home and tell my wife and 2 children that Aidan wouldn't be coming home. And that time it was starting to break daylight and I could hear birds. It was just surreal. We just hugged each other and cried, and there was no need for words.
The bomb had been planted by the Real IRA, a breakaway Irish Republican group opposed to the peace process, and its telephone warnings were inaccurate. Northern Ireland's worst single atrocity had been carried out just 4 months after its best hope of peace in a generation, the Good Friday Agreement. The bombing here should have been a watershed, signalling the end of violent Irish republicanism. But 25 years later, the threat posed by dissident groups like the new IRA is again deemed severe. For some, the war will never be over. And that's why data breaches by the police service, compromising staff security, are so serious. One officer narrowly survived a gun attack earlier this year. There's thought to be fewer than 100 dissidents actively engaging in violence, but they've demonstrated their capability by detonating bombs like this one in Londonderry. And it was during rioting in Derry's Craigan estate that one of their gunmen opened fire on police, fatally wounding Lyra McKee, a 29-year-old journalist.
I make no bones about the fact that I hate the people who took Lyra. I hate them because they ruined the life that I had, and I've had to rebuild my life from the ground up. I've lost everything that was before. And I hate them, but I don't wish harm or violence upon them. I just want justice.
Sarah, are you surprised, 25 years after the Omagh bombing, that there are still those pursuing Irish unity by violent means?
I think that there are people who will never be satisfied, no matter what happens. The rest of us have reached a level of contentment. You know, like, things are a lot better than they were. We're trying to move forward into a peaceful existence, and we're kind of managing it. And we just have these people who drag us backwards all the time.
And this is the Craigan, a council housing estate on a hilltop in Derry, just 5 miles from the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. It's attempting to shake off its negative image as a safe haven for dissident Irish Republicans. But there's no doubt they still have influence here. Patrick Gallagher's bail conditions prevent him from entering the Craigan estate. He has 2 terrorist convictions and faces additional charges, but agreed to meet us. He's the spokesperson for a small political party called CERU, the Irish word for liberation. It denies being the political wing of the new IRA. So do you and does that group either condemn or condone the use of violence in pursuit of Irish unity?
Well, in 2023, while Ireland still remains under British occupation, it is understandable that there is women and men out there that appears willing and capable of carrying out acts of armed resistance against the British state.
But Paddy, it's not understandable to many victims of that violence. What do you say to them?
Well, again, if you look at it in the wider political sphere, we are under occupation, and occupation breeds resistance, and with that comes political violence.
Many people would be really shocked to hear that from you. You're 31 years of age. The provisional IRA ceasefire was called 30 years ago, and yet you are still describing as understandable the use of violence in pursuit of Irish unity.
Well, as I say, we do still live under British occupation, and I think historically speaking, and if you look at it in an even longer historical context, Ireland has always had periods where there are uprisings, where there are groups or individuals who carry out acts of resistance, and that appears to be what is happening now.
Every Easter, CERU organises a march to mark the 1916 uprising against British rule in Ireland. And this year, as usual, it resulted in violence. Are dissident Republican groups or political parties like CERU radicalising in areas like the Craigan estate?
I think radicalising is a strong term for it. CERU don't seek out young people to recruit as party members. Young people, particularly around here in the Bogside and Craigan and all our working class communities throughout Derry and across the occupied 6 counties, have become more and more politically aware.
You say resistance is growing. Does that mean you believe more attacks are inevitable?
I think so. I think that's a general assessment from the occupying forces and from those here in the occupied 6 counties as well. If you look around, there does appear to be an attitude of resentment towards the Crown forces here and everything that they represent.
Militant Republicans don't live in the shadows here. You meet them on the street. They could be your neighbour, but no one talks about it. There isn't many of them, but political stalemate aids recruitment. When government isn't working, it strengthens their argument for the use of the gun. Lyra McKee's partner Sarah says those still engaged in violence need to recognise that most people in Northern Ireland have moved on and want peace. What does it mean to you when people like Paddy Gallagher use the word understandable in terms of the use of violence when it cost you the love of your life?
It's not understandable. It isn't understandable, because if it was, it would be something that was happening every single day and we'd all be coming out in support of it. In fact, the opposite is true. We all condemn it. You know, the vast majority of people here condemn violence. We don't want to go backwards. And there's a possibility to have dissident views and not be involved in violence. You can dissent, but use your words. Because realistically, that is the most powerful thing we have. I mean, look at gay marriage, abortion rights. Things like that were brought about by years of activism and people making their case plainly, but not using violence to do it.
The Omagh bombing, just 4 months after the Good Friday Agreement, shocked the world. The British and Irish governments vowed to stamp out the violence, but it continues to this day, albeit at a lower level. And despite countless attempts to secure justice, there's never been a single criminal conviction.
I mean, 25 years on, and nobody has went to jail for what happened in Omagh. It was one of the biggest catastrophes in the history of Ireland, of all Ireland. You know, 31 people, innocent souls, had no connection with security forces or political issues or anything like that. Murdered brutally in this town.
And with so many questions remaining about whether the bombing could have been prevented, they're pinning their hopes on a public inquiry later this year.
Those responsible are those that planned and prepared and delivered that bomb. Nobody should ever try and take that away from them. But we have the best intelligence service in the world, MI5 and MI6 and GCHQ. They have a responsibility to look after our safety and make sure these things don't happen. I feel that there were opportunities to stop the Omagh bombers before Omagh, and those opportunities, for whatever reason, were missed. And that's the answers we need to know.
It's been a long quest for justice, but they've never lost hope, motivated every day by the memories of those who did not come home.
There's pictures all over the house. Aidan is still very much a part of our family. Like next week, I'll be picking up a new car, and we will talk. We will say, what would Aidan think about this? He is always part of our family and always will be a part of our family. Sadly, he will always be 21, but we talk about him all the time.
And all of these years later, Stanley, how often do you think about that?
Every day. When you're waking up in the morning, you know, you go to bed at night, you come into that house. My two boys are still with me. They've never left me. Because that's the way it has affected them. You know, and it's cruel. You know, they didn't have a life after Anne was murdered. They didn't have a life.
But she's always with you.
Anne's always with me.